In the Kentucky General Assembly, prior to 1948, there were 69 House committees and 38 in the Senate, and legislators had virtually no assistance with research and bill drafting. Then, in 1948, the Kentucky legislature created the Legislative Research Commission. The governor was the chair, with 6 members of legislative leadership, but it had very few responsibilities and even fewer employees. In 1954, statute revision, bill drafting, and administrative regulations were placed into the LRC's hands. Growing staff also meant growing space requirements. The third floor of the Capitol was renovated to add space for leadership staff and committee rooms. Later, LRC staff moved into the fourth floor and the basement of the Capitol as well. At that time, the governor still had tremendous influence in helping to get legislators elected and in selecting legislative leaders, thus exerting tremendous control over the entire General Assembly. In fact, each morning of a legislative session, the governor delivered the list of bills that were to pass that day. Legislators only came to Frankfort every 2 years for 60 consecutive days. Because they were ill-informed and unprepared, legislators routinely bowed to the governor's wishes. In 1967, Republican Louis B. Nunn was elected governor, Democrat Wendell Ford lieutenant governor, and Democrat Julian Carroll was Speaker of the House. The political dynamics of dueling parties opened the door to legislative independence. Carroll and Ford, both products of the legislature, set about modernizing the LRC. The legislature would not remain a rubber stamp for an all-powerful governor. Committee numbers were vastly reduced. Between sessions, interim joint committees allowed Senate and House members to gather information and testimony on issues to be considered in upcoming sessions. Members could focus on a few specific areas of interest and become more proficient in those matters. Experts were hired to staff those committees, providing a professional, nonpartisan agency that improved institutional knowledge. In 1977, for the first time, leaders of the General Assembly selected the new LRC director instead of the governor, and they chose a familiar face, former Representative Vic Hellard from Woodford County. Coming from a legislative background, Vic knew the importance of a strong, independent legislature and the role of a competent professional LRC. In fact, most of the staff that Vic hired remained with the agency until their retirement. The General Assembly now had a confidant with the interest of the members and the institution at heart. Hellard continued to serve the General Assembly for nearly 2 decades, the longest tenure of any LRC director. Under his leadership, the LRC evolved into one of the premier legislative service agencies in the country. In 1978, legislative offices were added in the annex basement. Members of leadership had individual spaces, but rank-and-file members had cubicles about 5 feet by 8 feet crowded into one large room. And they had to share 12 assistants for 122 lawmakers. But for the first time, they had their own offices and their own phones instead of having to share a row of phone booths on the 3rd floor of the Capitol. In 1979, Kentucky voters approved the Kenton Amendment to the Kentucky Constitution, moving legislative races out of the gubernatorial election year, reducing the governor's influence on those races. It created the odd-year organizational session and expanded sessions from 60 consecutive days to 60 working days. The first computer system was installed in the 1980s, greatly assisting in the speed and accuracy of bill drafting and upgrading the agency's research and communications capabilities. In 1984, in the Brown v. LRC lawsuit, the Kentucky Supreme Court helped further define the separation of legislative and executive branch powers. And recent statutory changes to the process of executive orders demonstrates the continuing evolution between the branches of government. Today, LRC is governed by a 16-member committee comprised of legislative leaders from both the majority and minority caucuses. The agency has grown from around 50 full-time employees in 1977 to about 400 today. Employees staffed 20 standing committees in the House and 16 in the Senate in 2023. LRC staff members have not only excelled in their local accomplishments, but several staffers have received regional and national awards for their outstanding work. including staff chair for the National Council for State Legislatures, the highest staff leadership position in the country. Just as the work of the General Assembly is dependent on the quality of its lawmakers, the work of the LRC is dependent on the quality of its staff, and that quality lies in the hands, heads, and hearts of its employees.